talking about external policies. But in all policies what EU is having, the primacy should be in human rights. So that whatever EU does, it should respect human rights and then think anything else. But this, as you well know, has not become the member states of the European Union are not so, didn't agree, all of them, with this. Then I would, just before I finish, I would like to say a few words about Finns' opinions on foreign and security policy, national defense and security. We have a government body, the Advisory Board for Defense Information, so it's in the Ministry of Defense. They publish annually, a report where about 1,500 Finns have been interviewed on different, asked different questions about security and foreign policy and defense. And then they published this. And this year, one of the questions was that what causes greatest concerns for people in Finland what comes to security issues. Number one was climate change. 89% of Finnish who were interviewed said that climate change is the main concern. It wasn't Russia, or it wasn't nuclear weapons, or it wasn't Putin, or it wasn't the Emperor of Europe, or anything else. It was climate change. International terrorism was number two, and then global refugee situation number three, and then people also mentioned the political extremist movements, racism, social inequality in Finland, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and cyber threats. So that I think that our government has not yet understood that people are thinking a little bit differently, that the politicians are only waking up now, little by little, that actually climate change is something we should put much more efforts into and look much more what kind of effects it will have, not only to us, but for this whole planet. And as I said yesterday, to me that's the number one worry at the moment. And two other things still from this. Finns said that EU, UN and the OSCE have positive effects on Finland's security, so the majority of people think that. And then they also, the majority, definite majority, said that we're still supporting the military non-alignment, so that Finland is not looking for example, Nato membership. So, thank you.
Dave?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for asking me here. It is always a pleasure to come to Scotland. Even if you're independent, I shall still come. So
You need visa.
yeah, mainly. So I got involved in CND back in late 1970s, early 1980s. Having not really been politically motivated for anything before that, I was a scientist and thought this wasn't my business, it was politicians' business. And then I took a job in the Ministry of Defence and discovered I was wrong. It's the people's business. We should all be involved in something very important like defence, like all kinds of issues. Anyway, so I then joined CND. I left the MOD and joined CND. And at that time, of course, there was a huge membership of CND and peace movements around Europe. It was the time of cruise missiles, in Britain, and in Europe there were Pershing missiles, US Pershing missiles, and there was a height of the Cold War, there was real insecurity problems. Everybody was dreaming about nuclear wars and all kinds of things like that. And then of course the Greenham women on their march from Cardiff to Greenham Common, setting up camp there and coming out with fantastically strong arguments and strong methods for combating the military, and also kind of just enlarging the discussion and the debate about what society should be, how we should be structured, etc., etc. This was all kind of really exciting and new stuff. And eventually that huge kind of movement across Europe got rid of those nuclear weapons. It got rid of a whole range of intermediate nuclear weapons. And Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik and signed this treaty, the INF Treaty, which meant that none of those weapons would be allowed back. Now, of course, as you know, they're suspending from that treaty, Russia and America. Both of them were building up to this anyway. I mean, it looked like this was going to happen a little while ago, but nothing was really done to prevent it. It could have been prevented. I mean, the thing about the treaty is it has mechanisms within it to enable any kind of any problems that the signatories might have, the two signatories, to be able to be resolved through discussion, through diplomacy. But instead, both sides, I think, really have failed the treaty in one way or another, and they wanted it to be removed. They wanted it was standing in their way. And in particular in America, the US had already was starting to put together this idea of small nuclear weapons, so-called low-yield nuclear weapons that would be, quote, more usable. So, in other words, I mean, these are still, you know, atomic weapons. They're still nuclear weapons that will devastate large areas, kill thousands of people, capable of killing thousands of people. And yet they're now considering how they might actually be used rather than just as a deterrent, if that's what you believed in the first place. So, and these weapons now, these nuclear, these low-yield weapons are actually coming off the production line in the United States, ready to be deployed somewhere. And where might they be deployed? But Europe, of course. And that's the problem we're going to face now. How do we stop those weapons coming into Europe? And they'll come in under the guise of NATO. NATO already has nuclear weapons stationed in Europe, as you know. It has American nuclear weapons in Germany, in Italy, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in Turkey. And those weapons are actually not missiles; they're bombs. They can be loaded onto airplanes. But these low-yield weapons are also bombs, and also probably be put into missiles as well. So at the time of the 80s, as I mentioned, there was this huge outcry, this huge peace movement which removed those weapons. The problem is we don't have that now. We don't have this huge outcry against what's happening. We've got to bring it back, basically. We've got to make sure that these leaders know that we don't want these things here. We don't want them anywhere, but we certainly don't want them in Europe. So there's a problem, a big problem that we have to come to face. We also know that although they say they're low-yield nuclear weapons, and they're talking about, once again, keeping restraining a nuclear war, maybe just dropping a few nuclear weapons, and it not going any further. This is complete nonsense. I mean, it's rubbish. It wouldn't happen. I think any of you that have seen the film Dr. Strangelove will have heard of this idea of the doomsday machine, where once one nuclear weapon goes off, then they all go off. And Daniel Ellsberg, you'll probably have heard of him, some of you anyway, some of you may be too young, I don't know. But he was the one who copied the Pentagon Papers and brought that to the public attention during the Vietnam War. He was working for the Rand Corporation. He was a consultant for the Rand Corporation, so he was very high up in strategic kind of development for the US defense system. And he was involved in the nuclear weapon system too. And he's written a book called The Doomsday Machine. Some of you may have read, I don't know, or seen anyway. And he was saying there that what's mentioned in Dr. Strangelove was like a documentary. It was exactly the way it might, well, not exactly, there were some differences, but this is the way that things could happen. And it will only take a few nuclear weapons, or one or two, to start the whole thing off, because once one goes off, there is no time to consider what's actually happening. They will just send a retaliatory strike, and that will be a full-blown nuclear war, leading to a nuclear winter, leading to billions of people dying as a consequence. So this is a huge problem. We're on the verge of extinction. Not only, there are two things that threaten our very existence. Climate change has already been mentioned, and nuclear war, and it's still there, and people aren't realising this. I think it's becoming more realised now. We had quite a large number of young people come to see Dr. Strangelove, which was a surprise. We didn't expect quite so many, and we didn't expect them to be so young. When you're in the peace movement now, you just expect to see old people all the time. Anyway, so many of them, of course, they hadn't been born when the film was made. In fact, some of their parents hadn't been born when the film was made. So we did a little bit of explanation of what that was about and what Daniel Ellsberg was saying about the Doomsday Machine. And hopefully we'll get them more involved in building the movement to resist it. They're already, of course, worried about so many things. It's not surprising you don't see so many young people at meetings because they just want to do actions, and I can understand that. And their primary concern is climate change. I think that's the one that they're really concerned about, and the environment generally. But there's also now we have another thing that we can use in our for our campaign, and that's the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. And that was brought about, again, most of you will probably know about that. It was brought about by people like us, campaigners, people in the streets. It was a very well organised campaign centrally, but it relied on a large number of people and friendly states to bring this treaty about at the United Nations, and now it's there ready to be signed. It needs, as you know, I'm sure, 50 ratifications, signatures and ratifications to become into force, and I think at the moment there are 21 people who have ratified, or states that have ratified, and there's over 60 that have signed but not ratified yet. It's a process that it has to go through government. And I think it's been just over a year, hasn't it, since it came up for signatories. And to get that many in a year is actually pretty good. It beats by any means, out of a cocktail, into a cocktail or out of a cocktail, into a cocktail. The NPT treaty, for example, which took much longer to become into force. So we're getting there, and there's every reason to believe, and ICANN tells us they have every confidence that it will be coming to force this year. So that's a good thing. And the thing that we can use, although none of the nuclear states participated in that or want anybody to sign it, and they're putting a lot of pressure through NATO membership as well on states not to have anything to do with the treaty, there are ways into the treaty in Europe. There were a couple of countries, the Netherlands, for example, did actually turn up to the discussions about the treaty in the United Nations. I think they were the only ones who voted against the treaty, but they did at least turn up, and that was because of the pressure of the people to send them there. The people of the Netherlands wanted their government represented, actually I think they wanted their government to vote in favour of the treaty, although they didn't because of the pressure of NATO, or US and NATO. Also, you probably may have heard that in Spain, in fact, I have to look at your notes here, but Podemos, the opposition party, have made a deal with the president of Spain that in order to kind of support for his budget for this year, that one of the things they say, they had a list of demands. One of their demands was that Spain signs the treaty, and the Spanish government has agreed to that. Now, they haven't really mentioned it as such, they haven't talked about it, and they haven't given a date. But it's there, it's in, it's been agreed with the opposition. So there's every chance that Spain might be one of the first European countries, and certainly a first NATO country, to sign the treaty. So this is really amazing, and will be wonderful. And the other thing that we've got in Europe, the NATO nuclear weapons, the states that host those, none of the people really, not many people in those countries want those nuclear weapons in their country. It's like Scotland, you don't want nuclear weapons here, and they don't want nuclear weapons there either. So there's every chance that they can apply pressure to their governments to say, we've got to sign this treaty, get rid of these nuclear weapons, and get them out of our country and out of Europe. And I think that people are obviously working on that in their countries too. So there is there is a hopeful way forward for this. It might take some time, but hopefully it will eventually happen. And I just wanted to say a bit more about NATO, because NATO is one of the real big problems that we have, I think, in the world today. When the Soviet Union was dissolved, when it fell apart, basically, NATO promised Gorbachev, that they would not move 1 centimetre nearer to Russia in their membership. And of course, they basically recruited a lot of the states that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact and now border with Russia. And it's no surprise that Russia are pretty concerned about the march of NATO forwards. Also, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, is now spreading its clutches around the globe, basically. It's already got some agreements with Colombia in South America, Latin America, which is not part of Europe as I remember it last, and not even on the North Atlantic. But that's where they're going. NATO considers itself like the police force, if you like, a global police force, to present, and it acts as a marketing agency for the US military corporations. Because if you're a member of NATO, you have to have your equipment, your military equipment has to be interoperable with NATO equipment. And where is that built? It's built in the States. So you have to have their F-35 fighter bombers. You have to have all of the other paraphernalia that the Americans will sell you quite happily in order to be part of it. Also, if you consider how much money CIPRI issue their global military spending figures every year. The last time, it's usually around April time. And it's the time when we have this global campaign against military spending. Last year it was revealed that I think if you add up all the military spending of all the NATO countries, it's something like 70% of the total global military spending in the world. I mean, and they still say that it's not enough. We still hear from Trump that people have got to put more into NATO, pay more money into NATO. I don't think Trump had any inclination at all about removing the US from NATO. He wants it to be there. What he wants to do is bully people into spending more money so that they'll actually pay out more than they have been. The UK, of course, has politely obliged and has increased its spending on NATO. and it's increasing its spending on the military. And you probably have heard all that nonsense that Gavin Williamson came out with about when we're out of Europe, we can at last become another empire again once more. So you don't have to stay in Europe to be an empire. We can build our own. It's just utter nonsense. And I'm sure you realise that. So NATO, yes, I know it's not, as has been mentioned, SNP have a policy of staying within NATO, which I think is a mistake, and really they should think more carefully about what that means and what NATO is about, and the amount of money that Scotland, as an independent nation, would have to put into NATO. I mean, is that really what you want to do? Is that really how you want to spend your money? It doesn't make any sense. So let's kind of, work together, because I think the only way we can actually combat climate change, the only way we can combat the threat of nuclear weapons and creeping militarization is by working together, by cooperating together. And there are so many different campaigns which are all linked. Climate change and militarism are very heavily linked. Who is a major contributor to climate change, to carbon dioxide? It's the military. They churn out loads of materials, they burn up so much fuel, and they have no consideration about the environment or what they're doing. It's they basically have a free card to do whatever they like in the interest of security. So what we need, we need to work together to make sure that we first of all, let's rid Europe of nuclear weapons. There are alternatives to NATO, there's alternatives even to the EU. There's the OSCE, which has been around for a long time, you don't hear much about, but it incorporates, Russia is a member of that, and Russia has tried to become a member of NATO for many years, but they can't. They're obstructed from joining. And that's the only way really that we can ensure that we work together enough to overcome these big problems of climate change and militarization and nuclear weapons. These are huge problems, and they require a kind of global cooperation on a scale that's never really been seen before. And yet if we don't do it quickly, one of those things is going to get us. So let's do it. Thanks.
How do I follow that now, tell me? Well, you say there's two things that are endangering our world. Well, can I add the Democratic Unionist Party? Because at the moment, I think they're up there with those two. Thanks very much, David. That was lovely. Well, my name's Anne, and I'm from Northern Ireland, and I'm a peace person, and I'm a peace activist, and I've spent my whole life working to make people who are all peace people, peace activists, because I think most of the world are full of peace people. We all want peace. We all want peace in our homes, we want peace in our countries, we want peace in the world. But you have to take a wee step to become an activist. And I think that's where we fall down. We don't want to take that step. We don't want to become an activist. And probably my journey started, and you have to watch me for time because I just talk a little bit. My journey started when I was about 11, and I realised that I'm 71, so that was quite a long time ago. And in Northern Ireland, lots of people from the Holocaust were rehomed in Northern Ireland. Just in a detention centre, they were on their way to being processed on their way to Canada. They weren't going to be staying in Northern Ireland. But they were given jobs, and I happened to get a teacher, because, after the war things were mad, and my teacher was a Jewish woman, and obviously she was very traumatised, but we didn't know that at the time. She just read us stories about the Holocaust. 11-year-old children, it really wasn't appropriate. But that was okay. But I went home and asked my dad, because he had been in the army, why they had done this, why they put people in ovens. And because ovens to me were that size, just nothing worked in my head as an 11-year-old who was inquisitive and feisty. But anyway, I decided to look into it myself, so I read books myself and found out. And I thought, this is awful, and this should never happen, and I will never kill anybody. So I became a very passionate pacifist at 11. And I wrote to the Jewish community and said it was sorry, because it wasn't right. I'm a very passionate woman, so I do cry a lot, it's okay. So I wrote to them and told them it wasn't right. So I became then, you know, people that then took notice that somebody had said, well, this is wrong. This is wrong, you shouldn't kill people. So I spent the rest of my life, working for peace. And the sad thing was that we became hijacked into a situation in Northern Ireland when working for peace meant that you were actually on the ground working for peace. And I've been a grassroots peace activist all my life, done that. I started off when I was CND, before the troubles in Northern Ireland got really bad. I went over to London and did marches and was quite active with CND at that time, and then troubles hit our streets in a way that nobody would have ever thought possible. When we got each other, it was just awful, and I was very fortunate because lots of my friends and family were killed, but I was really fortunate because I started to work for the Quakers. I spent all my life really working for peace and reconciliation. Don't know why I'm so passionate tonight, but I was very, very fortunate that I was able to work in the communities, in both communities, because I had the Quaker label. I wasn't a Quaker, but I had the label. And the Quakers are very, very well thought of in Ireland. And that goes back 300 years. Nothing in Ireland simple, absolutely nothing in Northern Ireland simple. But 300 years ago in the famine, and I'll tell you one wee story because I know there's some Quakers here tonight. We were, one time, I worked in a family centre in a unit, and we had a minibus, and we used to go in and out Belfast and bring families from the divided communities to our centre. And we worked in a therapeutic way. I'm a therapist by training, and we worked in a therapeutic way to bring them together, bring them in, and show a different way. There has to be a different way than killing each other, you know. And the women were, it was all women and their children. The women were very marginalised in these areas at this time. And I remember Nick Clegg, who was a young British soldier, had killed, had shot dead, and it had been one of the very few times where a soldier was taken to court and he was sentenced. And at the end of, he only did like 3 months of his 10-year sentence, and he was let out on appeal. And the day he was let out on appeal, the whole of West Belfast erupted into violence. I think it was 87 bombings and whatever. And they sort of, our minibus was coming up this road in Ballymurphy, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of. And they stopped, there was a barricade, and they stopped. And I looked out, I was driving the minibus, and we had 3 overseas volunteers from America, young Quaker women. And I looked out the window and I said to the guy, "Do you want the minibus?" Because they just took your buses off you, or they just took your cars and buses and used them for barricades. We barricaded every night. We had thousands and thousands of cars destroyed. And they said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "We're from the Quakers." And they said, "Let the Quakers through." And they moved the barricade. They fed us in the famine. And I just thought, that's the psyche of Ireland, really, isn't it? You know, the Quakers fed them in the famine, so let them through. Also, they run the visitor centre down in McGabry and during the hunger strike. So I got really involved in working with the grassroots people, working with the prisoners. The Quakers set up a education system within the prison, one woman, and this is where I think that people have to, in groups and everything, they have to really understand that one person can do amazing things. seriously amazing things. Like one Quaker woman, Marty, went to work inside the prison, and she set up an education system in that prison that educated the paramilitary people in the H blocks, because remember, the prison officers didn't go into H blocks, they were run by themselves. The paramilitaries run Northern Ireland, so they're in the prison as well, they run inside that prison as well. And she set up an education program that educated people so that they would have a voice, so that they could go to a peace table and they could negotiate. One woman. It's amazing. So anyway, that's where I came from, and I was then very privileged to be part of the peace people who went on to bring people out onto the streets and say no. And I think at the time in 1976, when we came out onto the streets, we had really had enough. We had been traumatized for so long, and the violence was becoming so vicious. And psychopathic people had infiltrated organisations. We were having people's bodies being cut up and put into wheelie bins. We're having horrible things. I mean, things that happens in ISIS and things I've seen in Syria. We're only a wee tiny place, but all of that takes place inside war when violence becomes supreme. All of those things take place, all of it. And that becomes really horrible to live with if you have a heart in it, and so absolutely horrible. So I think we were completely burnt out by 1976, and it just became, the killings became really bad, and the bombings every single day, 4, 5, 6 bombings. It was just horrible, like. And when the peace people called people out on the street, it was just wonderful, because for the first time you realise, do you know, I'm not out here on these streets on my own every night, every day, trying to keep peace.
Do you want to show the film at this point?
Yeah, go ahead. Because I told you I could talk all night, that's you tell me now, I'm not talking anymore.
Could somebody over there turn the light off?
The light of the door.
Not quite yet.
The very early 70s in Northern Ireland, it was a time of chaos, destruction, killing. Every day there were bombs going off. People were very, very frightened. And this terrible sense of helplessness, we became used to it. It became our normality. We were going through a time where we had lost our son. And there just seemed to be no way to break the cycle of violence. On the 10th of August 1976, a young IRA man was driving in the car, and he was shot by the army, and his car went out of control and it killed 3 of my sister Anne's young children, and she was dangerously ill.
I was the uncle of the children. I was carried out in a coffin in the chapel. It was only 6 weeks old. I'm here in my arms with this young boy who you know, didn't get a chance to grow up like all the other young boys. Crystallised into that moment was the whole horror and injustice of war and conflict.
I felt deeply, deeply saddened by the absolute waste of human life and the senselessness of it all. And it struck a chord with everybody, but particularly with mothers. The sense of despair on that day was definitely the worst that I have ever felt in my life. It just made us all realise that it has to stop somewhere along, that this has to stop, this can't go on. People came out on the street and said, no, we don't want this anymore. But they came out in their thousands to walk for peace. We all came from the Falls Road to join with the Shankill, and we all walked up the Shankill together. The vast majority of the people of Northern Ireland didn't want the violence, and they wanted peace, and they wanted to be unified. You had office workers, factory workers, mums, grannies, sisters, teenagers. This was totally cross community, across everything. We were just, and we just wanted the violence to stop. A lot of the women were very frightened to meet women from across the divide. We received death threats, death letters, and our cars were destroyed. It didn't deter, it made people more determined. I mean, the next week more people came out to walk because they felt we're not going to be stopped. There was hope because we seen the true spirit of the people coming out to say we reject violence and killing and we want to work together.
It went from the hopelessness of the young Andrew in the coffin, and now all of a sudden there was new hope.
Even though it was born of tragedy, there was joy. Because we felt we're actually able to do something now. The Trafalgar Square rally was the final rally and a wonderful celebration of people from everywhere coming together and saying we reject the violence and we want peace. We have power, we have a voice, and our voice is never going to go away again. Politicians who of course must help lead the people, but in order to build that support and to challenge violence, a key element of that is the civic movement.
It's up to the people, it's up to civic society to bring about change based on fairness. The last resort is violence, and it's no answer. Gandhi proved that you can't have a revolution without violence. Martin Luther King proved that you can have a revolution without violence.
The peace people planted a seed of optimism in people to give us hope that you could make a difference.
Well, all of that. we've had 4 really stimulating and inspiring contributions, and what I'd like to do now is just have contributions, questions, whatever from you, to try to see what issues you feel we should be drawing out and developing and campaigning on in that wider European context. So anyone want to start? Bill?
A couple of questions, if I may.
Bill, it might help if anyone asking questions stands up.
Okay, Bill Ramsey, convener of SNP CND. Question to Anne, and then a question about to David. At various times, Finland has been challenged by Nato to try and get Finland to change its mind, and the Finns have sensibly not succumbed. Could you maybe say something about what they do and how the instructions have been rough, if you can see what I mean? NATO trying to get Finland to join, and Finland saying no. Could you maybe say a little about that? And David, because I've read a bit and I'll speak to you later, but given all this stuff about cyber security and all the rest of it we've had in a few years, surely that makes nuclear weapons even more unstable, because one of the things about the treaties is when they have a treaty, it's so that both sides don't do something new, so that they have their stability as they see it. And maybe you could say something like that, because I would have thought that would blow a hole in the idea of the very concept of nuclear deterrence. And the other one was, because you've been a scientist and all, all these developments of undersea detection systems, surely they make the concept of the submarine launched ballistic missile, i.e. that it's hidden, redundant for Trident at the moment, and certainly for Trident's replacement. Because if we've got all this technology at the moment that can spot submarine launched missiles under the sea, then the idea that in 5 or 10 or 20 years time will not even be more visible.
Okay. I'll take another question or comment, and then we'll go to the panel.
Sorry, just a comment. First, get involved later. See this idea that Scotland does not want nuclear weapons? That's not true. There are a lot of people out there. One politician, Jackie Bailey, has but there's an awful lot of people who support. We need them, and especially now with we need the jobs. Scotland needs jobs, right? So Scotland is building weapons that are blowing children off the planet all round. I'm going with you just now. But it's when we come to this and talking about the points, because I was very conservative, right wing, etc. till I marched with You for Peace, and now I've gone full circle with that man there, right? But let's forget this, that the people of Scotland don't want them. We've got to educate them. And it's not just nuclear, electromagnetic and bioresonic and you.
Okay, so can we go first of all the question in Finland, and then David, you can maybe take the 2 points.
Yeah, I think in Finland when we're talking about or thinking about which way is the best to secure our independence, that we are looking a very selfish way, and and at the moment the whole leadership of the country says okay, there are a few parties who are in favor of NATO membership, but the president, prime minister, and most of the politicians are saying that the best way for us is to stay outside. Then it's quite clear that whatever nature says, it doesn't have effect, because we have decided that at the moment that's the best way to stay independent and keep care of our own country. And of course this all is related to Russia. And people or our politicians and most of us see that if we would join NATO, Russia would probably see us as a threat. And at the moment they don't see. So it's very selfish thinking, which of course every country is supposed to, or has the right to. But if anything would change, that for some reason we would see that actually for us it would be better to be a NATO member, then I'm quite sure that we would make the decision. But at the moment we have counted that it's better to stay outside. But of course we are following NATO very, very closely, and then Finland and Sweden are the two countries which are closest to NATO without being members. So we participate in almost every level except that we are not members. And I was looking at this survey which was made in November this year. At the moment, or November this year, 59% of Finns said that no to question should Finland seek membership in NATO. 59 were against, but just a year ago, autumn 2017, the number was 62. So it has come a little bit down, but it's still around 60% of Finns. But we don't know what happens in 5 years. It's not something that we have decided that we're never being member. We look at the situation as it is, what is best for us, without thinking anyone else.
Perhaps just before Dave looks at the other questions, perhaps Roger might want to say something on the Irish neutrality situation and how it's being managed or undermined. Where is public opinion in Ireland?
Well, there's some great difficulty about being neutral on a US aircraft carrier at the same time. I think Ireland, the neutral state, is a US aircraft carrier. It has been since 2001, since they started going through. Going back to Europe again, they signed, and I quote it, I don't know if you all remember, but before NATO was founded, there was a thing called the Western European Union was founded. Does people know about that? Mm-hmm. Well, it was basically a European, purely European military agreement organization, right? And obviously it was superseded by NATO, but it didn't go away, it stayed there. And when after the Lisbon Treaty, the following Article 28A7 was signed, which Ireland did sign after the second time around, quote, if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all means in their power, according with Article 51 of the UN Charter. So what happened was that the Western European Union decided this was fantastic, so they completely disbanded. In other words, they regarded the Lisbon Treaty as giving a common defence agreement with this particular resolution. So they were essentially completely redundant. So no, Ireland is not neutral. It's a US aircraft carrier, and it's a supporter of the formation of a European army.
Okay, Dave.
Yeah, I wonder if I could just add a little bit about that, because NATO works in many ways, some of them mysterious, and one of them is to gather intelligence for their use, basically for the use of the military. And these intelligence gathering stations are all around the world, in fact. But Finland and Sweden in particular have a huge role to play in intelligence gathering for NATO. Mm. And the fibre optic cables that feed into Russia from Europe go through Sweden, in fact. And they're actually intercepted in Sweden for NATO purposes. And of course, Finland is involved as well in that kind of activity. But also, NATO has these things called strategic commands, STRATCOMs. These centres, so-called centres of excellence of some kind or another, including cyber warfare, scattered around Europe in all of its, not only its member nations, but also those who are so-called partners for peace. This idea of partnership for peace through basically bullying and militarism. They have these tentacles everywhere. So you don't really have to be a member of NATO to be a really important player in NATO. I'm sure you'll agree. But it's one of those invisible things that people don't get to hear about that much. And the same as what you were saying about cyber warfare. You're absolutely right. It's a threat to not just a threat to the existence of nuclear weapons, but to us all. You know, that something could go wrong with the systems. We found out that the operating system on computers on the Trident submarines was Windows XP, which they no longer support. But they have, they say, oh, it's a special version, it's all right, there's no need to worry. But also they say, well, we don't have to worry too much about cyber attacks on submarines because they're not connected to the internet. So therefore they're kind of freestanding, there's no way that cyber, but that's also nonsense. Because they have ways of introducing viruses through all kinds of different ways, through memory sticks, through other ways. And in fact, I don't know whether any of you saw the program about that, what's it called, I've forgotten the virus, that was actually originally came from America, but then was fed into it to basically... Sorry?
Stuxnet.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, it was, and then it was going to be used to destroy the separators in Iran and blow them up. And that was introduced in the same kind of way as it might be introduced in any kind of system that's supposedly independent of the internet. So there's huge problems, you're absolutely right, with that kind of system. And the underwater detection of submarines, yeah, we brought that to the attention of the government, I'm sure they know about it. They say they haven't got that technology doesn't exist yet, all these kind of things where our submarines are perfectly safe and all this. But it is, they are basically making nuclear weapons redundant. The other thing though, submarines redundant, but that doesn't mean to say you can't put them on missiles or you can't put them on bombers or whatever. There are other transport mechanisms than submarines. But I was going to mention something a little bit more about cyber security because just at the last NATO meeting, I think, or the one before, they decided that a threat, well, there's Article 4 of NATO, which is an attack on one country is an attack on all, so therefore everybody joins in, and that any attack could be dealt with by the use of nuclear weapons, even if they used nuclear weapons first. And NATO has not got a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, which is why they tell us the UK can't have that policy either, because our nuclear weapons are assigned to NATO, they might be used first in any kind of confrontation. So we can't have a policy of no first use. Many people in the country think we have got that policy, but we don't. So now the problem is that they are also including cyber attacks in this kind of thing. So if any country is attacked or their security systems are attacked by some kind of virus, then that could trigger a retaliation, and that retaliation could be nuclear. So we're living on a knife edge all the time, and that knife edge is getting thinner and thinner. And the trouble one of the troubles, there's so many troubles, but the problem is you don't know where a cyber attack is coming from. You don't know who's initiated it, or who do you retaliate to. But you would, of course, retaliate to the enemies who are the ones that you have at the moment, Russia, China, whatever suits you to retaliate against. So it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and it's not being taken really seriously. although the governments, including ours, are spending billions on supposedly cyber security, there's still no real 100% way of making sure that your systems are 100% secure.
Thanks. Some other questions? Well, then, you first and then you
Ask Anne a question, and Patrick. Just given all the stuff going on about Brexit, in particular in relation to the withdrawal agreement and the backstop, and we hear a lot here from certain sections of the Tory party and their Northern Irish branch, the UP, how it's not really an issue. I'm just curious, given you there and on the ground and knowing what's happening, what are people think? How nervous are people? How fragile actually is this if it's not properly resolved? Because it doesn't matter, it'll be fine, don't worry about it.
Do you want me to answer
Yes.
that? Well, we're very worried. Everybody in Northern Ireland's very worried, especially people who work so hard for peace, because this is a very volatile situation, and you're working with people who are incredibly volatile. We didn't get to the stage where we were killing one another in the streets. That happened very quickly. You know, that wasn't taking years to build up. And that can happen anywhere, and it can happen very quickly. You know, from 1971, Maria and I have travelled the world, and especially the last 15 years, we went all places of conflict, and you see the pattern repeating itself over and over again, and it is incredible. It's just like a knitting pattern that you follow, and it all falls into place. And we're very worried. To say we're not worried would be telling just a little bit stupid. We're really worried, because when they decided to do this here, they forgot that there's 286 border crossings. They had no idea, absolutely no idea about that, and they also thought they could buy the DUP. You know, they didn't realise that no meant no. And they should have realised that with the peace negotiations, because we were very involved. I was very involved at bringing people together to go into the peace negotiations. That's where my skills are, working with small group people. And bringing them in from the cold, bringing all the parties together. And you know something, it was really difficult and very, very hard work. And the British government knows that. They know how difficult that was and how big of work that was. And like, to think they could just buy those people and it would all be all right, I had no idea where they were coming from. I can't understand it for 1 minute. So we're very, very concerned what will happen, you know, and I think everybody should be concerned, you know.
Thank you. So did you want to?
A couple of things. One, I'm glad that you said that about the U.S. air carrier, because it did seem to me when you gave that presentation on Ireland a little odd to worry so much about EU military when in fact Ireland is a U.S. base, and the U.S. is the power. It's not the British are going to recreate the empire; those days are gone. Yeah. It's the U.S. empire. Sure, there are British troops, UK troops in Afghanistan. They're supporting the U.S. troops. That's what everybody knows that. They're cover for U.S. imperialism. So it would seem to me, if I were an Irish anti-militarist, I'd be focusing on the U.S. I agree actually with everything you said about the EU. I don't like the EU myself, but let's face it, when we come to who really counts militarily, it isn't the UK. It's the United States. Yeah. That's one thing. The other thing is, Dave, when you said there are U.S. Nuclear weapons in Europe, you're talking about stationary weapons. A few miles from here, there's a naval base that services U.S. submarines with nuclear weapons. No real difference between the Turks who have it, on their base. It's really the same thing, right? I mean, so let's keep that in mind. Scotland is one of those countries. UK is one of those countries. We should know that. If we want to get rid of nuclear